Richard Mdluli joined the South African police in August 1979 as a constable in Pietermaritzburg. Over 3 decades, he climbed through the ranks, becoming a station commander, then deputy police commissioner in Gauteng, and finally, on July 1, 2009, divisional commissioner of the Crime Intelligence Division. His official biography described him as an invaluable asset capable of motivating members and leading complex investigations. But by the time prosecutors finished building their case, they had documented something else entirely. A senior officer who registered 23 family members as covert intelligence operatives, looted R69 million from secret state funds, and allegedly orchestrated the murder of a man who married his former lover. This is the story of how a badge became a weapon, how surveillance tools meant for national security were turned against investigators, and how institutional authority transformed into private empire. Richard Mdluli's career began during the height of the apartheid regime's total onslaught strategy. The South African police functioned more as a paramilitary arm of the state than a civilian law enforcement agency. After starting in the detective environment in Pietermaritzburg, Mdluli was integrated into the Special Branch on the East Rand, a unit notorious for surveillance and interrogation of anti-apartheid activists. Former activists would later recall Mdluli as a persistent presence during interrogations in the 1980s, identifying him as an operative who understood the nuances of psychological pressure and clandestine information collection. This background instilled a reliance on secrecy and an us versus them mentality that would define his later actions. The Special Branch operated outside normal policing constraints. Officers were trained in techniques designed to extract information through psychological manipulation, extended detention, and systematic intimidation. Mdluli learned these methods during the most violent years of apartheid, when the security apparatus viewed the majority of South Africa's population as potential enemies of the state. The skills he developed, how to conduct surveillance without detection, how to manipulate institutional processes, how to use state resources for covert operations, would later be applied to serve personal rather than political ends. The environment in which Mdluli came of age as a police officer was one where the concept of civil rights barely existed for the majority of the population. The Special Branch had broad powers to detain suspects without charge, to conduct interrogations without legal representation present, and to operate with minimal oversight. Officers learned that institutional authority could be deployed without meaningful consequences, that the apparatus of the state existed to serve the political objectives of those in power, and that loyalty to superiors was more important than adherence to formal rules. This training shaped more than just operational skills. It created a worldview where the law was understood as a tool to be manipulated rather than a constraint to be respected. Officers saw how institutional processes could be bent to serve political purposes, how documentation could be manufactured or destroyed to shape narratives, how the veneer of legality could be maintained while conducting operations that violated fundamental rights. These lessons would prove valuable when Mdluli later needed to loot state resources while maintaining the appearance of legitimate intelligence work. When South Africa transitioned toward democracy in the early 1990s, many of Mdluli's peers were either purged or struggled to adapt to the new constitutional order. Mdluli successfully navigated the reforms. He was promoted to the officer cadre in 1991 and continued ascending, serving as station commander at Vosloorus before becoming deputy police commissioner in Gauteng. While his professional biography painted a picture of competence, investigative journalists and internal whistleblowers began surfacing a different narrative, that of a senior officer who utilized his station not for public safety, but to cultivate a network of loyalists and to suppress investigations that threatened his personal standing. The transition from apartheid to democracy created opportunities for those who understood how to operate in both systems. Mdluli presented himself as a reformed officer committed to the new South Africa, someone who could help build a constitutional police service. He participated in training programs on human rights and constitutional policing. He spoke the language of transformation and community service. He understood which phrases would reassure reformers that he had embraced democratic values. But the mentality and methods of the apartheid security police remained intact beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to reassert themselves when oversight weakened and political protection became available. His ability to navigate the transition was partly due to timing. The early democratic era in South Africa was characterized by a desire for reconciliation and a reluctance to conduct wholesale purges of the security services. Many officers from the apartheid era were retained on the grounds that their experience was valuable and that transformation should be achieved through integration rather than exclusion. This policy had merit in many cases, but it also meant that individuals who had internalized the methods and mentality of the apartheid security apparatus remained in positions of influence. The retention of these officers created a dual system within the police service. On the surface, there was the constitutional language of human rights, accountability, and service to the public. Beneath that surface, the old networks persisted. Officers who had learned their craft under apartheid and who understood how to operate in the shadows. These networks became particularly valuable to politicians who needed extra-legal services, surveillance of opponents, suppression of investigations, manipulation of evidence. Mdluli positioned himself at the intersection of these two worlds, speaking the language of transformation while maintaining the capacity for the old methods. The case that would eventually define Mdluli's criminal profile began with a personal dispute during his tenure as head of detectives at the Vosloorus police station in the late 1990s. Upa Ramagibe had married Chidi Buthelezi, a woman who had previously been Mdluli's lover. What followed was described by witnesses as a campaign of intimidation indistinguishable from the tactics of the apartheid security police. Testimony from the Ramogibe family details how Mdluli, often accompanied by junior officers Samuel Delomo and Nkosana killer Jimba, would conduct late-night raids on their home. They would shout at Ramogibe's mother, Sophia, and force her to accompany them on searches for her son. The raids followed a pattern. Officers would arrive after dark, bang on the doors and windows, demand entry, and then systematically search the property while hurling threats and insults. Sophia Ramogibe described being dragged from her home in her nightclothes, forced into police vehicles, and driven around Vosloorus while officers searched for her son. The psychological impact of these raids was severe. Sophia lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next raid would occur. The unpredictability was part of the torture. Sometimes weeks would pass without incident, lulling the family into a false sense that the harassment had ended, only for the police to return in the middle of the night. Neighbors witnessed the police vehicles arriving, the shouting, the searches. The entire community understood that challenging Mdluli carried consequences. The raids were not conducted quietly or discreetly. They were public displays of power designed to intimidate not just the Ramogibe family, but anyone who might consider opposing Mdluli. The raids also served to isolate the family. Neighbors were afraid to offer support or testimony, knowing that any association with the Ramogibe family could make them targets as well. This social isolation compounded the psychological pressure, leaving the family without community protection or solidarity. They were on their own, facing the full weight of a police apparatus that had been weaponized against them. Ramogibe himself had opened an attempted murder case at the Vosloorus station in late 1998 after a previous attempt on his life. Someone had shot at him, and he had narrowly escaped. He reported the incident to the police, providing details about the attack and his suspicions about who was responsible. Because Mdluli controlled the detective branch, the investigation was allegedly sabotaged and the dockets tampered with. Evidence that should have been collected was ignored. Witnesses who came forward found their statements disappeared from the file. The case went nowhere, sending a clear message. The police station that was supposed to protect Ramogibe was instead being used to hunt him. The pattern of docket tampering would become a recurring theme in Mdluli's career. As head of detectives, he had access to all case files in the station. He could remove documents, alter records, or ensure that investigations never proceeded. This control over the institutional memory of the police station gave him enormous power. Cases could be made to disappear, evidence could be destroyed, and witnesses could be intimidated into silence, all without leaving a clear trail of interference. The docket tampering was sophisticated. Mdluli did not simply destroy entire case files, which would have been obvious. Instead, critical pieces of evidence would go missing. Witness statements would be misfiled. Forensic reports would be delayed until they were no longer useful. Chain of custody documentation would have gaps that made evidence inadmissible. The cases would still exist on paper, but they had been gutted of anything that could lead to prosecution. On a day in February 1999, Upa Ramogibe was gunned down while pointing out a crime scene to a police officer who was Mdluli's subordinate. The circumstances of the killing raised immediate questions. Ramogibe had been asked to accompany the officer to a location, ostensibly to provide information about another crime. While they stood at the scene, gunmen approached and opened fire. The police officer was conveniently unharmed. Ramagibe was hit multiple times and died at the scene. The murder method suggested professional execution. The shooters knew exactly where to find Ramagibe, knew he would be at that location at that time, knew which individual to target while leaving the police officer untouched. This level of coordination pointed to inside information. The fact that a police officer was present during the shooting but emerged unscathed raised questions about whether he had been positioned there deliberately to lure Ramagibe into a kill zone. The murder sent a message about the dangers of challenging a senior officer's personal authority. For over a decade, the investigation remained dormant. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were silenced through fear. The trauma inflicted on Ramogibe's mother, Sophia, who lived in constant fear for years, highlights the human cost of a law enforcement agency repurposed as a private instrument of power. She continued to live in the same community where Mdluli's subordinates patrolled, knowing that speaking out could bring the same fate that had befallen her son. The fact that Ramagibe was killed in the presence of a police officer made the crime particularly brazen. It suggested that Mdluli's network was confident that they would face no consequences, that witnesses could be intimidated or silenced, and that the institutional machinery would protect them. The police officer who was present during the shooting was never charged, never publicly identified in a way that would allow for independent investigation. The message was clear. Loyalty to Mdluli meant protection, while opposition meant danger. The decade-long dormancy of the case was not passive neglect. Active measures were taken to ensure it remained unsolved. When family members tried to inquire about progress, they were told the investigation was ongoing, but that no leads had developed. When journalists asked questions, they were stonewalled or fed misleading information. The case file was moved between different units, ensuring that no single investigator maintained continuity or developed expertise about the details. This deliberate mismanagement kept the case technically open while guaranteeing it would never be solved. The year 2009 marked a turning point for the South African security cluster. Following the inauguration of Jacob Zuma as president, there was a rapid reshuffling of leadership in the intelligence and policing sectors. On July 1, 2009, Richard Mdluli was appointed as the Divisional Commissioner of Crime Intelligence. The appointment process itself was highly irregular and suggested a prioritization of political loyalty over professional merit. Mdluli was interviewed by a ministerial panel that included Jacob Zuma's closest allies, Police Minister Nathi Mathethwa and State Security Minister Siyabonga Chwele. The speed of the appointment raised eyebrows among career intelligence professionals. Mdluli had been serving as the head of crime intelligence in Gauteng, a provincial position, when he was suddenly elevated to lead the national division. There were other candidates with more extensive intelligence experience and cleaner records, but the panel selected Mdluli. The decision suggested that factors beyond professional qualification were at play. Career intelligence officers who had expected to be considered for the position were shocked by the outcome. Some had decades of experience in intelligence work, had managed complex operations, and had built reputations for professionalism. They watched as Mdluli, whose primary qualification appeared to be political loyalty rather than intelligence expertise, was elevated over them. The message was clear. Under the new administration, political connections would matter more than professional competence. The official announcement from the government described Mdluli as having extensive experience in intelligence gathering and analysis, and praised his dedication to the safety and security of South Africans. The press release made no mention of the Ramagibe case or the questions that had been raised about his conduct at Vosloorus. Instead, it presented him as a skilled professional who was being promoted based on merit. The disconnect between the official narrative and the reality known to those familiar with Mdluli's history was striking. Analysis of the timing suggests that Mdluli's elevation was a reward for his role in the spy tapes saga, which had enabled Zuma to escape corruption charges just months prior. As the head of crime intelligence in Gauteng, Mdluli had allegedly facilitated the procurement of illegal recordings of conversations between senior prosecutors. These recordings captured discussions about the timing of corruption charges against Zuma, discussions that Zuma's legal team argued demonstrated political interference in the prosecution. The recordings became known as the spy tapes, and they were instrumental in getting the corruption charges against Zuma dropped in April 2009, just weeks before the election that would make him president. The decision to drop charges was controversial and was criticized by legal experts who argued that the recordings did not demonstrate improper interference, only normal prosecutorial discussions about case strategy. But the political impact was decisive. Zuma was able to contest the election without the shadow of pending corruption charges. The spy tapes episode demonstrated the value of having loyalists in control of intelligence resources. The recordings had been obtained through surveillance capabilities that were supposed to be used only for legitimate intelligence purposes. Instead, they had been deployed to serve the political interests of one faction within the ANC. The success of this operation, it had, after all, achieved its objective of getting the charges dropped, established a template that would be repeated throughout Zuma's presidency. By placing Mdluli at the helm of the National Crime Intelligence Division, the new administration secured a loyalist who possessed both the knowledge and the willingness to use clandestine resources to protect the presidency from further legal challenges. It was an investment in insurance, someone with access to surveillance capabilities and covert resources who owed his position directly to the president. Mdluli understood that his appointment was political, that his primary loyalty was expected to be to the president rather than to the Constitution, and that his continued tenure would depend on his usefulness in advancing and protecting the interests of the Zuma faction. The Crime Intelligence Division that Mdluli inherited was already troubled. Years of underfunding and politicization had eroded its capacity. Skilled officers had left for better opportunities in the private sector, or had been pushed out during previous rounds of political interference. Equipment was outdated, with surveillance technology that lagged behind what criminals and foreign intelligence services were using. Morale was low, with officers uncertain about the division's mission and their role in the new political dispensation. But the division still controlled significant resources. The Secret Service account, with its millions in covert funding, a network of informants and operatives, surveillance capabilities that could be deployed against targets, and institutional authority that came with being part of the National Police Service. Mdluli's first moves as divisional commissioner focused on consolidating control. He began replacing key personnel with loyalists, individuals who owed their positions to him and who could be counted on to follow instructions without asking uncomfortable questions. Officers who had reputations for independence or professionalism were transferred to other units or encouraged to take early retirement. The purge was conducted gradually enough to avoid attracting attention, but within months the senior leadership of crime intelligence had been transformed into a network of Mdluli appointees. Once installed at the head of crime intelligence, Mdluli oversaw the Secret Service account, a covert fund designed for gathering intelligence and protecting national security. The SSA operated outside normal budgetary oversight. Expenditures did not require the same level of documentation as regular police spending. The account was meant to pay for informants, covert operations, safe houses, and other sensitive activities that could not be disclosed through normal channels. The logic behind the SSA was sound. Intelligence work requires secrecy. If every expenditure had to be publicly documented, it would compromise operations and endanger sources. Informants need to be paid without creating paper trails that could identify them. Safe houses need to be established without public records that would reveal their locations. Covert operations need funding that cannot be traced back to the state. The SSA was designed to provide this flexibility while still maintaining basic accountability through oversight by senior officials. But the oversight mechanisms were weak. The head of crime intelligence had broad discretion over how SSA funds were spent. There was no independent audit function that regularly reviewed expenditures. External auditors were not given access to SSA records on security grounds. Parliamentary oversight committees received only general briefings about the account's existence and purpose, without details about specific expenditures. The assumption was that the head of crime intelligence would exercise this authority responsibly, using the funds only for legitimate intelligence purposes. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong in Mdluli's case. The weak oversight was not accidental. Intelligence agencies around the world struggle with the tension between operational secrecy and democratic accountability. Too much transparency can compromise operations. Too little oversight enables abuse. South Africa had tilted toward secrecy. partly because of lingering apartheid-era attitudes about intelligence work and partly because post-apartheid governments had been reluctant to be seen as constraining the security services. This created an environment ripe for exploitation by someone like Mdluli, who understood how to manipulate the system. Forensic investigations would later reveal that the SSA had been transformed into a slush fund used to finance a lavish lifestyle for Mdluli, his family, and his inner circle. The mechanism of this looting was sophisticated, involving the creation of ghost agents and the misuse of safe houses and covert vehicles. The ghost agents were particularly insidious. These were individuals registered as intelligence operatives who received salaries, benefits, and operational funds despite performing no actual intelligence work. At least 23 members of Mdluli's family and friends were registered as covert intelligence operatives. These individuals, including his wives, children, and siblings, were placed on the police payroll despite having no training or involvement in actual intelligence work. Mdluli's son was appointed to a cybercrime unit despite having no IT expertise. His wives were listed as field agents despite never leaving their homes. Siblings were placed on specialized teams despite lacking any relevant qualifications. The process of registering these ghost agents involved creating false personnel files. Each ghost agent was given a cover identity, an operational code name, and a fabricated work history. On paper, they appeared to be legitimate intelligence operatives with specialized skills and important assignments. The files included performance evaluations that praised their contributions to national security. They included operational reports that described their supposed intelligence gathering activities. The documentation was sophisticated enough to pass cursory review, creating the appearance of a functioning intelligence network. The ghost agent files were masterpieces of bureaucratic fiction. One file described a supposed cybercrime specialist who had conducted critical investigations into online fraud networks. Another detailed the work of a field agent who had infiltrated organized crime groups. The reports included technical jargon, operational details, and references to successful operations. Anyone reading these files without independent verification would conclude they were looking at the records of skilled intelligence professionals contributing meaningfully to national security. In some instances, the ghost agents were given official identification cards and access credentials. They received regular salaries, sometimes exceeding $20,000 per month. They were issued government vehicles ostensibly for operational use. They had access to crime intelligence facilities and systems. On paper, they looked like a functioning intelligence network. In reality, they were family members drawing state salaries while continuing their private lives, effectively creating a family welfare scheme funded by taxpayers and administered through the Crime Intelligence Division. This was not merely financial theft. It was institutional capture, where the personnel of a critical security unit were replaced by loyalists who owed their livelihoods directly to Mdluli. The operational capacity of crime intelligence was compromised. Resources that should have been directed toward investigating organized crime, terrorism, and serious corruption were instead diverted to maintaining the fiction of a ghost agent network and funding personal enrichment. Real intelligence officers within the division witnessed this transformation with growing alarm. They saw individuals with no relevant skills being appointed to specialized units. They observed family members of the divisional commissioner drawing salaries without performing any work. They noticed that operational budgets were being diverted to purposes that had nothing to do with intelligence gathering. But speaking out carried severe risks. Officers who raised concerns were sidelined, transferred to undesirable posts, or subjected to disciplinary proceedings on fabricated charges. One officer who questioned the appointment of unqualified personnel to his unit found himself accused of insubordination and placed under investigation. Another who raised concerns about financial irregularities was transferred to a remote posting far from his family. The message was clear. Questioning Mdluli's decisions would end your career. Better to keep your head down, do your job as best you could within the corrupted system, and hope to survive until retirement. The culture of fear that Mdluli cultivated was reinforced through strategic use of the division's surveillance capabilities. Officers understood that crime intelligence had the technical capacity to monitor communications, track movements, and gather compromising information. The implicit threat was that crossing Mdluli could result in being placed under surveillance, having personal information leaked, or being framed for misconduct. This created a climate where self-censorship became the norm, and loyalty was maintained through fear rather than respect. The abuse extended to personal travel. SSA funds were used for business-class trips to Singapore and China. In late 2009, Mdluli and senior colleagues Solomon Lazarus and Heine Barnard traveled to these countries. The official purpose was to procure technical surveillance equipment for the division. Intelligence agencies regularly purchase sophisticated monitoring technology, and overseas procurement trips are part of standard practice. The procurement of surveillance technology is legitimately sensitive. Equipment specifications need to be kept confidential to prevent targets from developing countermeasures. Negotiations with suppliers often involve classified technical discussions. Travel itineraries need to be protected to avoid compromising relationships with foreign intelligence services. These legitimate security concerns create space for abuse because they make it difficult to verify whether a procurement trip was genuine or simply a cover for personal tourism. But investigators found that the funds were used for high-end shopping, luxury electronics, and expensive gifts for their spouses. The group stayed in five-star hotels, dined at expensive restaurants, and used state funds to purchase personal items. Receipts recovered during the investigation showed purchases at luxury boutiques, electronics stores, and jewelry shops. The state alleges that Mdluli personally looted R$100,000 just for business-class flight tickets for his wife on one such trip, despite her having no official role in the procurement process. The pattern repeated across multiple trips. Each time, the official purpose was procurement or liaison with foreign intelligence services. Each time, the actual activities included extensive personal shopping and tourism. The surveillance equipment that was supposedly being evaluated and purchased often never materialized or arrived in quantities far below what the expenditure would suggest. The trips became a mechanism for converting state funds into personal luxury goods while maintaining a veneer of official purpose. One particularly egregious trip involved Mdluli, Lazarus, and Barnard spending several days in Singapore. The official record showed they were meeting with suppliers of surveillance technology and evaluating equipment for purchase, but the recovered receipts told a different story. The group had spent thousands of rands on designer clothing, luxury watches, and high-end electronics. They had dined at some of Singapore's most expensive restaurants, including establishments that charged several $100s per person for a single meal. They had stayed in hotel suites that cost more per night than the monthly salary of a junior police officer. The Singapore trip included purchases at luxury brands that had no conceivable connection to intelligence work. Receipts showed spending at high-end fashion boutiques, jewelry stores, and electronics retailers. One receipt documented the purchase of a luxury watch worth over $50,000. Another showed the purchase of designer handbags and clothing. These were not items that could plausibly be explained as operational necessities or even as reasonable expenses for officials traveling on state business. When they returned to South Africa, they submitted expense reports that claimed the entire trip had been operational in nature. The receipts for personal shopping were mixed in with legitimate expenses, making it difficult to separate private enrichment from official business. The surveillance equipment that was supposedly purchased was either never delivered or arrived in quantities that could not justify the expenditure. The trip had been, in essence, a luxury vacation paid for by South African taxpayers and disguised as official business. The pattern extended to trips to China as well. Official records showed that Mdluli and his colleagues were meeting with Chinese technology suppliers and evaluating surveillance systems. But here too, the spending patterns revealed a different story. Large sums were spent on personal items, luxury goods, and entertainment. The group visited tourist attractions, dined at expensive restaurants, and shopped at high-end retail districts. The surveillance equipment that was supposedly being procured was either never delivered or delivered in such limited quantities that it could not possibly justify the expenditure. Covert funds were used to buy luxury BMWs and Mercedes-Benzes. The vehicles were ostensibly for undercover operations, but they were registered to Mdluli and his associates and used for personal transportation. One particularly egregious example involved a top-of-the-line BMW purchased for over R$800,000 using SSA funds. The car was registered to a shell company controlled by Mdluli and parked at his private residence, never used for any intelligence operation. The justification for purchasing luxury vehicles with covert funds was that intelligence officers needed cars that would allow them to blend in with criminal networks. If an officer was investigating organized crime figures who drove expensive cars, the officer needed a similar vehicle to maintain credibility and avoid arousing suspicion. This logic was not entirely without merit. Undercover work does sometimes require officers to adopt lifestyles and appearances that match their targets. But the vehicles purchased with SSA funds were not being used for undercover operations. They were registered to Mdluli personally or to companies he controlled. They were parked at his private residences and used for daily commuting and personal errands. There was no operational justification for these vehicles. They were simply luxury cars, purchased with state funds and appropriated for private use. The paper trail showed that the vehicles had been approved for purchase as part of crime intelligence's fleet, but there were no operational logs showing their deployment, no reports documenting their use in investigations, no evidence that they had ever been used for anything other than personal transportation. One vehicle, a Mercedes-Benz worth over $700,000, was registered to a company that existed only on paper. The company had no employees, no office, no operations other than owning this single vehicle. Forensic investigators traced the company's registration documents and found that it had been created specifically to hold the vehicle title, with Mdluli as the beneficial owner. The vehicle was kept at his residence and used by family members. The state had paid for a luxury car that became, in effect, a family vehicle with no connection to intelligence work. $150,000 was spent on security upgrades at Mdluli's private residences. The work included installation of alarm systems, security cameras, perimeter fencing, and reinforced gates. While senior intelligence officers do face genuine security risks that justify protective measures, the upgrades were carried out at properties that Mdluli personally owned, increasing their value while being paid for by the state. The invoices were processed through the SSA as operational security expenditures, bypassing normal procurement procedures. The security upgrades were justified on the grounds that the head of crime intelligence was a high-value target who required protection. This was not entirely unreasonable. Senior intelligence officials can be targeted by criminal networks or hostile foreign intelligence services. But the upgrades were carried out at Mdluli's personal properties, not at official residences provided by the state. The work increased the market value of properties that Mdluli owned, effectively using state funds to improve his personal assets. The security installations were high-end and extensive. The alarm systems were sophisticated setups that would normally be installed at facilities requiring maximum security. The cameras were professional-grade surveillance equipment capable of recording in high definition and storing footage for extended periods. The perimeter fencing was reinforced with anti-climbing features and integrated with motion sensors. These were not basic security measures. They were comprehensive systems that cost far more than would be justified for protecting a private residence. Private homes were leased to the state to pay off personal bonds. Mdluli owned several properties that were mortgaged. He arranged for these properties to be leased to crime intelligence as safe houses, with monthly rental payments that covered his bond payments. The state was effectively paying off Mdluli's personal mortgages while he continued to own the properties. When investigators examined the supposed safe houses, they found that many had never been used for any intelligence purpose. They were simply private residences where Mdluli or his family members lived, with the state paying rent to itself through Mdluli as the landlord. The safe house scheme was particularly clever because it exploited the legitimate need for secure locations where intelligence officers could meet informants, conduct surveillance operations, or house protected witnesses. Safe houses are a standard tool of intelligence work, and it is normal for intelligence agencies to lease properties for this purpose. But Mdluli had turned this legitimate function into a personal enrichment scheme by leasing his own properties to the state at inflated rates. One property that was leased as a safe house was actually Mdluli's family home where his wife and children lived. The lease agreement described it as a secure facility for sensitive operations, but investigators found family photos on the walls, children's toys in the rooms, and no evidence of any intelligence activity. The monthly rent being paid by the state was several times the market rate for comparable properties in the area. Over the course of the lease, the state paid enough in rent to cover the entire remaining balance of Mdluli's mortgage, effectively giving him a property free and clear at taxpayer expense. Another supposed safe house was a property where Mdluli's extended family members lived. The lease described it as a monitoring station for surveillance operations, but investigators found it was simply a residential property with no special equipment or security features beyond what would be normal for a private home. The rent payments were structured to coincide with Mdluli's bond payment schedule, making it clear that the purpose was to service his personal debt rather than to provide operational facilities for crime intelligence. These actions established a culture where the resources of the state were viewed as personal property of the intelligence hierarchy. Junior officers who witnessed the looting understood that merit and hard work were less important than loyalty to Mdluli. The division's operational effectiveness declined as officers realized that career advancement depended on participation in or silence about the corruption, breeding a sense among rank-and-file officers that there was no benefit to dedication when those at the top were openly enriching themselves. The impact on morale was devastating. Officers who had joined crime intelligence out of a genuine desire to serve their country found themselves working in an environment where corruption was not only tolerated, but rewarded. Those who tried to maintain professional standards were viewed with suspicion and marginalized. Those who participated in the corruption were promoted and given choice assignments. The message was clear: the path to success in crime. Intelligence under Mdluli was loyalty to the divisional commissioner, not excellence in intelligence work. Some officers responded by doing the minimum required to keep their jobs while seeking opportunities elsewhere. Others became cynical, viewing their positions as sinecures rather than meaningful public service. A few tried to maintain professional standards in their own work while ignoring the corruption around them, compartmentalizing to preserve their sense of integrity. And some joined the scheme, accepting benefits and participating in the looting, rationalizing that if they did not take advantage of the opportunities, someone else would. Mdluli's influence extended beyond financial malfeasance. He operated as a political securocrat who used the division's surveillance capabilities to monitor internal ANC politics. In late 2010 and 2011, he submitted a series of intelligence reports to President Zuma, claiming there was a widespread conspiracy to unseat the president. These reports named prominent ministers and police officials, including Bekisele and Tokyo Sexwale, as part of a plot to destabilize the government. The reports allege that senior figures in the ANC and government were working with foreign intelligence services, business interests, and remnants of the Mbeki faction to remove Zuma from power. They described alleged meetings, financial transactions, and communications that supposedly proved the conspiracy. The reports were presented as the product of crime intelligence's surveillance and informant networks, lending them an air of authority and credibility. One report claimed that Bekisele, who was then the National Police Commissioner, was coordinating with unnamed business interests to fund a campaign against Zuma. The report included details about alleged meetings between SEAL and business figures, financial transfers that supposedly funded opposition activities, and communications that indicated planning for a leadership challenge. The level of detail suggested sophisticated surveillance, but investigators would later question whether the intelligence was genuine or fabricated. Another report suggested that Tokyo Sexwale, a prominent ANC figure and businessman, was using his international connections to build support for a challenge to Zuma's leadership. The report describes Sexwale's meetings with foreign investors, his communications with international political figures, and his alleged efforts to position himself as an alternative to Zuma. Again, the report included enough specific detail to seem credible while remaining vague enough to be difficult to verify independently. The report served multiple purposes. They provided Zuma with intelligence that reinforced his existing suspicions about internal opposition, making the president dependent on Mdluli for information about threats to his position. They positioned Mdluli as an indispensable ally who could identify and monitor the president's enemies. They provided justification for actions against political opponents. If these figures were plotting against the president, then removing them from their positions could be framed as necessary for political stability rather than factional warfare. But when investigators later examined these reports, they found little substantive evidence to support the conspiracy claims. The reports appeared to be constructed from fragments of legitimate intelligence mixed with speculation, rumor, and political gossip. Some of the alleged meetings had occurred but were routine interactions that had been reinterpreted through a conspiratorial lens. Some of the financial transactions existed but were legitimate business dealings that had been mischaracterized as funding for political opposition. Some of the communications were real but had been taken out of context to suggest plotting where none existed. The reports served a political purpose rather than an intelligence function, reinforcing Zuma's paranoia about internal threats while positioning Mdluli as an indispensable ally who could identify and monitor the president's enemies. They were intelligence as politics, using the apparatus and authority of crime intelligence to advance factional objectives within the ANC. When the Hawks and other agencies began to close in on his criminal activities in 2011, Mdluli pivoted to a defense strategy that combined racial grievance with claims of a political third force. He alleged that the murder and fraud charges were part of a racist-driven plot by white officers and remnants of the Mbeki era to unseat him. He pointed to the fact that some of the investigators pursuing his case were white and argued that they represented old apartheid-era networks that had never accepted transformation of the police service. This racial framing was calculated to resonate in a society still grappling with the legacy of apartheid. By casting himself as a victim of white racism, Mdluli sought to mobilize political support and make it more difficult for prosecutors to proceed without appearing to side with apartheid-era power structures against a black officer. The strategy exploited legitimate concerns about transformation and racial justice to shield criminal conduct from accountability. The racial defense had some surface plausibility. The police service in South Africa remained demographically imbalanced, with white officers overrepresented at senior levels in certain units despite years of transformation efforts. There were legitimate questions about whether transformation had gone far enough and whether old networks from the apartheid era still wielded disproportionate influence. By tapping into these legitimate concerns, Mdluli sought to reframe his prosecution as part of a broader struggle over transformation rather than a straightforward case of criminal conduct. He coined the term Project Libambi Lingashoni, translated as, "Let us wage a relentless campaign to see to it that he does not survive," to frame legal accountability as a coordinated political attack. The phrase suggested an organized conspiracy rather than legitimate law enforcement activity. By casting himself as a victim of political and racial targeting, Mdluli sought to transform a criminal case into a political controversy, making it more difficult for prosecutors to proceed without appearing to take sides in factional battles. The Libambi Lingashoni narrative became central to Mdluli's defense. He presented himself as a reformer who had been targeted by unreconstructed elements from the apartheid era who resented black leadership in the intelligence services. He claimed that the charges against him were fabricated, that evidence had been manufactured, and that the investigation was coordinated by individuals with political motivations. He positioned himself as a victim fighting against powerful forces that wanted to destroy him for political and racial reasons. By sending a letter to Zuma in November 2011 promising to assist the president to succeed in the upcoming elective conference, Mdluli explicitly traded his institutional neutrality for political protection. The letter was remarkable for its candor. Mdluli did not pretend to be an impartial intelligence professional. He openly declared his allegiance to Zuma and offered to use his position to advance the president's political interests. The badge that should have represented service to the Constitution was explicitly transformed into a shield for factional survival. The letter described Mdluli's willingness to deploy crime intelligence resources to support Zuma's political objectives. It offered intelligence on rivals within the ANC, surveillance of opposition figures, and operational support for the president's campaign to retain the ANC leadership. It promised to use the full capabilities of crime intelligence to advance Zuma's interests. It was, in effect, a contract. Mdluli would use state resources to serve Zuma's factional interests, and in return, Zuma would provide political protection against prosecution. The letter made explicit what had been implicit in Mdluli's appointment, that crime intelligence under his leadership would function as a political tool rather than a professional law enforcement agency. The division's resources, its surveillance capabilities, its covert funds, its institutional authority, would be placed at the service of one faction within the ruling party. The constitutional mandate to serve all South Africans, regardless of political affiliation, would be subordinated to the imperative of protecting the president and advancing his political agenda. To protect the criminal enterprise within crime intelligence, a systematic purge of independent law enforcement bodies was initiated. This process targeted the Hawks, the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, and the National Prosecuting Authority. Any official who attempted to investigate the looting of the slush fund or the Ramogi murder was met with revenge prosecutions and retaliatory suspensions. Anwar Dramat, the national head of the Hawks, and Shadrach Sibiya, the head of the Hawks in Gauteng, were among the first targets. Sibiya had been instrumental in reopening the investigation into Mdluli. As the provincial head of the Hawks in Gauteng, he had authorized the investigation into the Ramogi murder and had begun examining the financial irregularities in crime intelligence. His persistence made him a threat to Mdluli's network. Sibiya was a career investigator with a reputation for integrity and competence. He had been involved in several high-profile corruption cases and had earned respect within law enforcement for his willingness to pursue cases regardless of the political connections of the targets. When the Ramajib case was brought to his attention by investigators who had gathered new evidence, he authorized its reopening and assigned resources to pursue it properly. He understood that the case was politically sensitive. It involved a senior intelligence official with connections to the presidency, but he believed that his mandate as head of the Hawks required him to pursue evidence of serious crime regardless of political considerations. Sibiya was accused of involvement in an illegal rendition of Zimbabwean nationals. The case involved several Zimbabwean men who had been brought to South Africa and handed over to Zimbabwean authorities in 2010. The rendition had allegedly violated proper extradition procedures, which require judicial oversight and respect for the rights of the individuals being extradited. The case had some basis in fact. There had been a rendition operation, and there were questions about whether proper procedures had been followed. But Sibiya and many observers believed the timing and emphasis were suspicious. He was accused of misconduct in a case that had occurred years earlier, with the charges being revived just as he was closing in on Mdluli. The rendition case was complex and involved multiple agencies and jurisdictions. Sibiya had been one of many officials involved, and his specific role was limited. He had authorized certain operational aspects of the rendition based on information provided by other agencies, but he had not been the primary decision-maker. Yet he was singled out for prosecution while others involved faced no consequences. The selective prosecution suggested that the case was being used as a pretext to remove him from his position. The rendition case became a tool for paralyzing the Hawks' investigation into Mdluli. Sibiya was placed under investigation, which limited his ability to oversee the Mdluli case. He was eventually suspended, removing him from his position and allowing loyalists to be installed in his place. The investigation into the rendition dragged on for years, keeping Sibiya sidelined and preventing him from pursuing corruption cases. By the time he was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, the damage had been done. The Mdluli investigation had been disrupted, evidence had degraded, and the momentum had been lost. Robert McBride, the director of IPID, was suspended after he produced a report clearing Dramat and Sibiya of wrongdoing. IPID had investigated the rendition allegations and found that while there were procedural questions, there was no evidence of criminal conduct by Dramat or Sibiya. The rendition had been authorized at high levels, had been conducted in coordination with multiple agencies including the State Security Agency, and had followed operational protocols even if those protocols did not fully comply with formal extradition procedures. McBride presented this report to the police minister, expecting it to end the matter and allow Dramat and Sibiya to continue their work. Instead, he was suspended for allegedly leaking the report and conducting an unauthorized investigation. The suspension was based on claims that McBride had exceeded his authority by investigating the matter without proper authorization and that he had violated confidentiality by sharing the report with unauthorized parties. Both charges were questionable. IPID's mandate included investigating police misconduct, and McBride had shared the report with the minister as required by protocol. McBride's testimony at the Zondo Commission years later described a Zuptoid captured police hierarchy that prioritized the protection of corrupt networks over the constitutional mandate of the police. He explained how legitimate investigations were disrupted through manufactured controversies, how independent officials were removed through trumped-up charges, and how the oversight bodies meant to ensure accountability were themselves targeted for destruction when they attempted to function. The pattern was consistent across multiple cases. Investigators who pursued corruption cases against politically connected individuals would suddenly find themselves under investigation for unrelated matters. Prosecutors who refused to drop charges would be transferred to positions with no authority over the cases they had been building. Oversight officials who produced reports critical of corruption would be accused of procedural violations or unauthorized disclosures. The mechanism was always slightly different. Sometimes it was allegations of procedural irregularities, sometimes accusations of leaking information, sometimes claims of insubordination. But the result was always the same: the removal or neutralization of officials who threatened the corrupt network. The purge extended beyond individual officials to entire institutions. The Hawks, which had been created to replace the disbanded Scorpions as South Africa's elite anti-corruption unit, saw its capacity systematically degraded. Skilled investigators left in frustration as their cases were blocked or their findings ignored. Budgets were cut, forcing the unit to do more with less. Equipment was not replaced, leaving investigators working with outdated technology. Training programs were defunded, preventing the development of new skills and techniques. The message was clear: the Hawks were no longer welcome to investigate high-level corruption. IPID, which was meant to provide independent oversight of police misconduct, was similarly targeted. Its budget was reduced below the level needed to fulfill its constitutional mandate. Its reports were systematically ignored by the police service and the minister. Its director was suspended on questionable grounds. The institution continued to exist on paper, but its ability to fulfill its role was severely compromised. Oversight had become a bureaucratic exercise rather than a meaningful check on police power. The impact of this purge was the near-total collapse of the state's capacity to investigate high-level corruption. McBride noted that the SAPs ran on patronage, and billions of rands were stolen or abused while thousands of citizens became statistics in the country's rising crime rate. The grabbers and surveillance equipment meant to fight organized crime were instead deployed to track the very investigators who were trying to uphold the law. Resources that should have been directed toward protecting the public were turned inward, used to protect corrupt officials from accountability. The purge also had a chilling effect on potential whistleblowers throughout the criminal justice system. Officers who might have been tempted to report corruption saw what happened to those who spoke out. They saw senior officials with sterling reputations suspended on trumped-up charges. They saw careers destroyed and lives disrupted. They saw that even being vindicated years later did not undo the damage. The lesson was clear: challenging corruption at the highest levels carried unacceptable risks. Better to remain silent, to focus on staying out of trouble, than to risk everything by trying to uphold the law. This climate of fear extended beyond law enforcement to other government institutions. Auditors who uncovered irregularities learned to write reports that documented problems without naming politically connected individuals. Prosecutors learned to seek approval from senior officials before pursuing sensitive cases. Journalists who investigated state capture faced harassment and intimidation. Civil society organizations that litigated corruption cases found their funding scrutinized and their tax status questioned. The message permeated the entire system. Challenging the corrupt network carried consequences. The ability of Mdluli to remain in a position of power for years despite overwhelming evidence was facilitated by a collapse in the integrity of the national prosecuting authority. In December 2011, Lawrence Merwebi, the head of the Specialized Commercial Crimes Unit, irregularly withdrew the fraud and corruption charges against Mdluli. Merwebi's decision, which he claimed was based on a lack of jurisdiction to investigate intelligence matters, was later described by the courts as a fundamental violation of the rule of law. Mr. Weby's reasoning was that the Hawks lacked the authority to investigate matters related to intelligence operations, and that the charges against Mdluli should therefore be dropped. He argued that intelligence work was governed by special legislation that placed it under the authority of different oversight bodies, and that the Hawks had overstepped their mandate by investigating crime intelligence activities. This argument had no basis in law. The Hawks have jurisdiction to investigate serious corruption regardless of which government department is involved. Intelligence operations do not grant immunity from prosecution for crimes like fraud and theft. But Merwebi's decision gave Mdluli a temporary reprieve from prosecution, buying him crucial time to consolidate political support. The decision was made hastily and without proper consultation. Merwebi did not seek input from the prosecutors who had been building the case. He did not consult with senior officials at the NPA who had expertise in jurisdiction questions. He did not commission a legal opinion from independent experts. Instead, he made the decision quickly and announced it publicly before anyone could raise objections. The speed and manner of the decision suggested that it had been made under external pressure rather than through careful legal analysis. NOMG Kobo Jiba, then the acting National Director of Public Prosecutions, further shielded Mdluli by failing to review Merwebi's decision or push for prosecution despite internal reports recommending that the case proceed. As the head of the NPA, Jiba had the authority and responsibility to ensure that prosecutors were pursuing cases properly. Internal NPA documents showed that senior prosecutors had flagged Merwebi's decision as problematic and had recommended that charges be reinstated. They had prepared legal memoranda explaining why Merwebi's jurisdiction argument was incorrect. They had compiled evidence showing that the case against Mdluli was strong. Jiba ignored these recommendations and allowed Mrwebe's decision to stand. This collaboration between the police intelligence chief and senior prosecutors created a permissive environment for corruption that defined the era of state capture. When the very institutions meant to investigate and prosecute corruption instead work to shield corrupt officials, accountability becomes nearly impossible. The NPA's failure represented a catastrophic breakdown in the rule of law, signaling to corrupt officials throughout government that they could operate with impunity as long as they maintained the right political connections. The impact extended beyond the Mdluli case. The withdrawal of charges sent a message that senior officials with political connections were effectively untouchable. Prosecutors throughout the NPA understood that pursuing cases against politically connected individuals could end their careers. Investigators understood that even if they built solid cases, those cases could be derailed at the prosecution stage. The entire criminal justice system was compromised, with the institution that should have been the last line of defense against impunity instead functioning as a shield for the corrupt. It was only through the persistent litigation of civil society groups like Freedom Under Law that these decisions were eventually set aside by the High Court and the Supreme Court of Appeal, forcing the NPA to reinstate the charges. Freedom Under Law brought a legal challenge, arguing that Mrwebe's withdrawal of charges was irregular and unlawful. The organization compiled evidence showing that the decision had been made without proper consideration of the facts and without following correct legal procedures. They demonstrated that Mrwebe's jurisdiction argument had no legal basis, and that the decision appeared to have been made for reasons other than the merits of the case. The litigation took years and required substantial resources. Freedom Under Law had to raise funds to pay for legal representation, to compile the record of evidence, and to pursue the case through multiple levels of the court system. The organization faced resistance at every stage, with government lawyers arguing for narrow interpretations of standing and jurisdiction that would have prevented the case from being heard. But Freedom Under Law persisted, understanding that the Mdluli case was about more than one corrupt official. It was a test of whether civil society could force accountability when state institutions had failed. Richard Mdluli joined the police in 1979 as a constable and learned his craft in the apartheid special branch, where the methods were surveillance, intimidation, and the weaponization of state power against perceived enemies. He survived the transition to democracy by presenting himself as a reformed officer while maintaining the capacity for the old methods. He climbed to the top of crime intelligence in 2009, appointed by a president who valued loyalty over integrity and who needed someone willing to use state resources for factional political purposes. The Secret Service account that was meant to protect national security became a private fund. Luxury vehicles worth over $800,000 were purchased with covert funds and registered to Mdluli personally. Overseas trips to Singapore and China became shopping expeditions, with $100,000 spent on business class tickets for family members who had no official role. Security upgrades worth $150,000 were installed at private residences, increasing property values while being paid for by taxpayers. Properties owned by Mdluli were leased to the state as safe houses, with rent payments that covered his personal mortgage bonds. But the ghost agent network represented the most systematic abuse. At least 23 family members and friends were placed on the intelligence payroll despite having no training, no skills, and no involvement in actual intelligence work. They received salaries exceeding $20,000 per month. They were given official credentials and access to government facilities. They were assigned to specialized units, cybercrime, surveillance, field operations, despite lacking any relevant qualifications. In total, these ghost agents drew millions in salaries over years, creating a family welfare scheme administered through crime intelligence and funded by South African taxpayers. The total documented in the fraud charges was $69 million looted from the Secret Service account. But the true cost was far higher. The operational capacity of crime intelligence was gutted as resources were diverted from legitimate intelligence work to personal enrichment. Skilled officers left in frustration or were pushed out for questioning the corruption. Surveillance equipment was deployed against investigators rather than criminals. The division that was supposed to protect South Africa from organized crime and terrorism became an instrument of factional politics and personal enrichment. The Mrwebe case reveals the human cost in the starkest terms. Ramogibe married a woman that Mdluli had previously been involved with in the late 1990s. What followed was a campaign of terror conducted by police officers under Mdluli's command. Late-night raids on the family home. Sofia Ramogibe dragged from her bed and forced into police vehicles to search for her son. An attempted murder case opened by UPA that was sabotaged through docket tampering. Then the killing in February 1999, gunned down in the presence of a police officer who emerged unharmed. For over a decade, the case remained dormant. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses were too afraid to speak. Sofia lived in the same community where Mdluli's subordinates patrolled, knowing that challenging them could bring the same fate. It was only when the Hawks reopened the investigation in 2010 that the full extent of the institutional cover-up became clear. Mdluli was eventually convicted in 2019 of intimidation, kidnapping, and assault related to the case. He was sentenced to 5 years and released on parole after serving a third of that sentence. The murder itself remains officially unsolved, with prosecutors unable to prove beyond reasonable doubt that Mdluli ordered the killing. The protection of Mdluli's criminal enterprise required the systematic dismantling of accountability institutions. Shadrach Sibia, who reopened the Ramogibe investigation, was accused of misconduct in an unrelated rendition case and eventually suspended. Anwar Dramat, the national head of the Hawks, was similarly targeted and forced out. Robert McBride, who cleared them of wrongdoing, was suspended for producing his report. The message was clear. Investigating Mdluli's crimes would end your career. The collapse of the NPA was equally critical. Lawrence Merwabi withdrew fraud and corruption charges in December 2011 on spurious jurisdiction grounds. NOMG Kobo Jiba, as acting national director, failed to review this irregular decision despite internal recommendations that charges be reinstated. Only persistent litigation by Freedom Under Law forced the courts to intervene, with the High Court and Supreme Court of Appeal eventually ruling that the withdrawal had been unlawful. But years had been lost, evidence had degraded, and Mdluli had remained in his position throughout, continuing to loot and obstruct. The political dimension was made explicit through testimony at the Madlanga Commission in September 2025. KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi alleged that Police Minister Nathi Mthethwa had directly forced the withdrawal of charges against Mdluli in 2011. This was not prosecutorial independence or legal judgment. It was political interference at the ministerial level to protect a loyalist who was useful to the president. The fraud trial finally began in May 2025, more than 13 years after the initial charges. Mdluli, Solomon Lazarus, and Heine Barnard pleaded not guilty to 15 charges. Colonel Kobus Rulofsky has been walking the court through bank statements, receipts, and procurement records, documenting each transaction that diverted state funds to personal enrichment. The trial continues as this account is written, with dozens of witnesses still to testify. The institutional legacy is visible throughout the South African Police Service. Crime intelligence remains weakened, its capacity degraded by years of corruption and politicization. The Hawks struggle to investigate high-level corruption, constrained by inadequate resources and institutional memory of what happens to officers who pursue politically connected targets. IPID continues to exist but remains under-resourced and frequently ignored. The NPA is slowly being rebuilt, but the damage from the Zuma era persists in lost expertise, compromised credibility, and lingering questions about independence. The Mdluli case demonstrates how a democratic state's institutions can be captured and repurposed. The surveillance capabilities meant for protecting national security become tools for factional politics. The covert funds designed for intelligence operations become slush funds for personal enrichment. The institutional authority that should serve the Constitution becomes a shield for criminality. The badge stops protecting citizens and starts protecting those who wear it while looting the state. The pattern was sophisticated. Create ghost agents to replace skilled officers with loyalists. Use legitimate operational categories like procurement and safe houses as covers for theft. Exploit the secrecy inherent in intelligence work to avoid oversight. Deploy racial grievance narratives to complicate prosecution. Secure political protection by trading institutional neutrality for factional loyalty, and systematically dismantle any institution that attempts accountability. Each element reinforced the others, creating a system where corruption was protected by multiple layers of defense. Richard Mdluli's story is not an aberration, but a template, a demonstration of how institutional authority combined with political protection and weak oversight can be transformed into criminal enterprise. The fraud trial may eventually deliver a verdict on the R69 million in documented theft, but the broader damage to institutional capacity, to public trust, to the rule of law itself, has already been done and will take far longer to repair than it took to inflict.